This time on Poll Hub, we've had a very busy week with our final round of polls, a national with our partners NPR and the PBS NewsHour, and 3 big battleground states. We're going to talk about all of these, the things that are in these polls that are standing out to us. We're also going to walk you through some tips on understanding what all the polls this cycle really tell us. And we finish with a not so fun at all fact from 1937 that is sadly relevant 85 years later. We're going to talk about that, so let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm J.D. Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho.
And I'm Lee Marengoff.
Well, we took the week off and we got some massages and ate some bonbons. It was a nice week, right, guys?
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, blue
Put on a
skies,
few
blue
pounds.
water.
I did eat a lot of the leftover Halloween candy, but
Well, but that was because we were so busy doing things. That was the only food you had time to eat.
That's it.
Let's leave it at that. So we have been, as we suggested, very busy polling, as you would expect, the final week before a big election. Many people calling this the most important election of our lifetime, although that's been spread around almost every election. Somebody says that. Let's start with our national. We did it with the NPR and the PBS NewsHour, our regular partners for our national polls. Directionally, the big questions nationally seem to favor Republicans. I think I'm not going too far out on a limb to say that, but I thought there were some pretty interesting things in here. Lee, let's start with you. You dug through all this. What stood out?
well, I think several things, of course, but on the so-called congressional generic question, as you indicated, Jay, the Republicans are standing at an advantage now, and that's really a change from what we've seen before, and that's because 88% of Republicans tell us they're definitely going to vote, and only 82% of Democrats tell us that. So we have a change in those numbers, so that the Republicans are now riding the reins on the congressional ballot question. But I thought there was one other very interesting finding in this, and then I'll pass it around to my colleagues. The question we asked also was whether you prefer to have a president and Congress of the same party or not. And in this instance, given that Joe Biden is the president and he's a Democrat, what that translates into, do you prefer the Democrats to keep Congress or not? Or do you want to see a divided government? And for more than a decade, people have divided on this question. They preferred divided government. They preferred that there be a different party in Congress than in the White House. And yet in this particular poll, the numbers totally flipped. 59% say they would like to have it the same party, which is a sort of a side language for maybe we don't want stagnant gridlock, dysfunctional government. Maybe if things are unified, we can move ahead. Democrats are 3-1 on that question of having the president and Congress in the same party. Republicans were pretty much even on it, which I thought was interesting. That doesn't mean they're going to go in a voting booth and say, hey, if I vote for this Republican for Congress, I'm now creating divided government, and I don't want that. But it is an attitude that nonetheless people think that if you have divided government, stuff can come to a grinding halt, and they're not interested in that for sure.
Yeah, and I might just follow up on what Lee was talking about the greater interest and enthusiasm to vote among Republicans compared to Democrats. When we were around the Dobbs decision, and actually the leak of the Dobbs decision in May and then the final decision at the end of June, you saw a lot of intensity and a lot of mobilization by Democrats. In fact, I think the generic that Lee was talking about was about +7 after the Dobbs decision. Well, we've seen that narrow as we've gone through the summer and now the fall. And as we are getting to Election Day, it's a more familiar pattern. In other words, the party out of power seems to have the greater intensity and greater likelihood of going to the polls. Although that's not to say that that Democrats are not turning out. I think that turnout is up, at least in the early vote in most states. I think what was interesting, and we can talk a little bit about this when we get to our state results, but we actually see in places that had early voting that Republicans and independents were participating in large number in the opportunity to vote before Election Day. Although Republicans are still more likely than other folks to vote in person on Election Day, I thought it was interesting, particularly in places like Arizona that has, strong opportunities for early vote, that was also the case. My only other observation, I think that's interesting, and again, it's kind of a comparison between the national and the states, is that we don't really see the issues being nationalized. There is, to a degree, a national issue that is concerning most Republicans, and that's inflation and the economy. But after that, we see a whole slew of issues that's top of mind for Americans, and is even as we get into the states, that changes a bit as well. So for Democrats, they're looking to the issue of preserving democracy, but they're also concerned about abortion. They're concerned about health care, and there doesn't seem to be a one driving issue, particularly when we start looking at the states, that really you can draw consensus around what Democrats and independents who lean Democrat are going to the polls for.
One of the things that stood out in the national to me was who's participating or say they're going to participate, who's definitely voting. And among the silent generation, baby boomers, 94% say they're definitely voting. Fairly typical. Gen X, 86%. And then there's this dramatic fall off to Gen Z and millennials. And remember, we're not talking about people that are 25. Gen Z and millennials go pretty far up the scale now into the age groups. And that's 65% say they're definitely voting. I think that's something to watch because we've heard about this for year in, year out about young people not voting. And there's a lot of pressure on young people to vote right now because of the issues that concern them not being necessarily addressed. Things that we saw with, for instance, college loans that was addressed, or global warming, climate change. So interesting to see if they're just saying they're not that many are saying they're definitely voting, or if they actually do end up turning out. That I would think would be a big difference maker.
And to your point, Jay, the most recent NBC national poll had the younger age group at Democrats in terms of the congressional vote plus 30, and the Republicans carried all three other age groups.
Yeah.
So that we'll have to see whether that plays out, because the early vote suggests it's a little closer than those numbers. But if the Democrats do well, it's going to be because young people show up.
So let's go to the states. We did Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Arizona as our final three battleground states. Just out of the field very late, doing the numbers very late. And
the numbers are fresh off the press. I mean, do we still talk about presses anymore?
They're right out of the oven, and the smell of fresh baked cookies is permeating the room. Let's start with Georgia. Raphael Warnock is the Senate Democrat who is the incumbent. And among registered voters, we have him at 49, and Herschel Walker, the Republican, at 45. So 49, 45. Among those definitely saying they're going to vote, 48, dead tie. We've seen that before in Georgia. Barb, let's start with you.
I think what stands out is, when we're talking nationally, and even when we're talking about the congressional generic, we're focusing on a big picture. But what's really interesting is when we drill down into these states, and we can really see the differences in terms of the issues that are important, the character of these states. Georgia is just a more Republican state. The party identification in the poll that we just did is +6 Republican and +8 points among those who consider themselves definite to vote. So that in itself just gives the Republicans a distinct advantage. Biden isn't popular. Not surprise, but we actually found, places where he does have support, but not in Georgia. So Biden is approval rating is 38-56, and also the congressional generic statewide is a +5 Republican and a +8 Republican among definite voters. So that's a long way of saying that Warnock really has a tough race here. Yes, he has an edge among registered voters, but when we look at those people who are most likely to vote, this is neck and neck. And I think there's also a sense that this is a state that can determine the majority in the Senate, just like folks in Arizona and Pennsylvania are also thinking about. So it's probably less about character and less about the candidates than it is about that, at least when it comes to the Senate. Now, when you look at the governor's race, Kemp has been doing well throughout this campaign against Stacey Abrams. Right now, he has an 8-point lead among those who are definitely planning to vote. Abrams only really has support among voters who characterize their communities as urban. And she does still edge Kemp in the Atlanta suburbs, but that's the place where a Democrat really needs to take hold in order to be successful.
Yeah, and I would just add to that the difference between the Senate race, one of the differences among the definitely vote and the governor's race is among independents, where Warnock is carrying independents among those who say they definitely will vote. But Kemp, the Republican, is carrying the independents in the race for governor. And I would say that one of the things that does seem to come through in Georgia is that there is one popular politician, and that's the governor, Kemp. He's at a 56% favorability rating to only 34% negative. We don't see a lot of 50s around the country, and we haven't seen it. And 56 is almost 60, or it's closer to 60 than 50. That's quite astounding to me. And Abrams with a 47% negative is 13 points more negative than Kemp is, and I think that that stands out. And I would say one thing about the Senate race, and I think it's probably all I need to say: runoff. I think, as Jay said, we've seen it before, and we may see it again. If you remember last time, we had 2 Georgia Senate races, so there is some crossover party votes here. We hear about party and we hear about issues, but in some instances, in Kemp's case and a little bit in Warnock's case, the candidate qualities seem to matter more, because Kemp was very strong in standing up to Donald Trump after the election. Herschel Walker is obviously in this because of Donald Trump. And so you have, in a sense, 2 incumbents in this race. You have Joe Biden effect as the president, but you also have the shadow of Donald Trump as the former president, and they're very much part of the chemistry in Georgia.
I did just want to kind of put an exclamation point on what Lee was talking about in terms of how Governor Kemp in Georgia held fast to Trump's pressure for, I think, the 11,000 odd votes that they were looking for after the November election. We asked the similar question as we had in all the states about how confident people were in their state and local officials to run a fair and accurate election. And Georgia, I think, really stands out. It's not just because 76% of Georgians have confidence in the process and the electoral system, but there's barely a party difference. So 85% of Democrats have confidence, 75% of Republicans, 72% of independents. Extraordinary, and not something we're seeing around the country.
Certainly not in Pennsylvania, which is where we move next, where there's almost a 50% percentage point gap between Democrats and Republicans on faith in their local elections. So we're swinging in that one question. We're going from the far extreme to the other extreme. So in Pennsylvania, we've got, similar to Georgia, we've got a governor's race that doesn't seem to be as close, and we've got a Senate race that is very close. And in this case, this is an open seat and a pickup opportunity, because it's a Republican incumbent, for Democrats to pad their lead or to make up for a loss that they might have if they try and hold the Senate majority. So John Fetterman, the Democrat, is at 50%. Dr. Oz, the Republican, who you know from TV, is at 44% among registered voters. And among those definitely voting, there's not that much of a change here. The gap is the same percentage point number. It's 51 to 45. Lee, Fetterman's over 50 in both definite voter and registered voters. At least when I used to be a political reporter, over 50 was a pretty good sign this close to the election.
Yeah, and I think we do have him as, probably as a leaning winner in here. The numbers are still single digits, and I think that's always a cautionary tale. But this is a different state. Pennsylvania, first of all, Biden's approval rating, I hate to say it's high, but it's at 42, which is better than 38. So the Democratic candidates have less to cover. On the definite
And there
vote,
are actually groups in Pennsylvania that are more positive about the president than negative, and I think that is something that is quite surprising. Not just Democrats. We see, particularly among women, the president is doing much better.
Yeah, and when we looked again, and in Georgia, we saw the definitely vote was favoring the Republicans. Here, it's almost identical, 91 to 90. Democrats saying they're definitely going to vote, Republicans at 90, independents at 82. So there again, the party differences are not as extreme as they were facing the headwinds that the Democrats are facing in terms of the fundamentals in Georgia. Not so here. And Fetterman in the race for the Senate over Dr. Oz, he's actually ahead, sometimes narrowly, among all age groups. Again, the best is with the youngest, the worst is with the oldest, but he is at least nominally in front among all those age groups, and a wide gender gap there. And of course, the Philadelphia suburbs are a big deal in Pennsylvania elections, have been. And I thought one thing was very interesting. We talked about issues earlier. Number one issue in the Philadelphia suburbs is inflation at 30. Number two is preserving democracy at 29. And number three is abortion at 24. So in the case of the Philadelphia suburbs, which is a pivotal swing area, the issues of inflation are not as dominant as the more democratic issues. And I think that's making a difference here. And as you said, Jay, in the governor's race, that looks to be fairly lopsided, in part because the Republicans negative 15 in terms of his favorability, whereas the Democrat Shapiro is plus 18. And if I can just flip back to the Senate race for 1 second, Fetterman's about even in terms of his favorable, unfavorable, but Dr. Oz has taken a hit, and it's a product of a lot of the negative advertising and attack ads, but he's got a 52% negative rating in the state. So he's got to flip that a little bit, or this race doesn't get closer than it is. And the Democrats, I think, very much have to carry the state in order to hold the Senate, because a lot of the other states, their incumbent is on the line and fighting for their political life. So in a sense, at a 50-50 break in the Senate, this is probably the best opportunity the Democrats have for maintaining and picking up a seat. It's also the best opportunity for the Republicans to break to break the back of the Democrats if their other ones remain close or they don't do well. So Pennsylvania. Tell us how Pennsylvania is going to go for the Senate, and we're going to know an awful lot about, I think, the next makeup of the Senate in Washington.
All right, so let's head out west and get some sun. Actually, it's 70 degrees here today, so I don't know what I'm talking about. It's lovely here in the Northeast. Anyway, let's get out to Arizona. Arizona is a state that used to be red, turned purple, and has 2 Democratic senators now, so who knows. Out in Arizona, Mark Kelly, who is an incumbent Democrat, fighting to save the seat against Republican Blake Masters. Among registered voters, we have Mark Kelly at 49 and Blake Masters at 45. When we move to the definite voters, it's a 50-47. Arizona, I will remind you, in 2020, we had that as a tie for Biden and for Trump in 2020 in our final poll. and it was a tie. I mean, what did Biden win by 18,000 votes out of millions cast? So it was a tie. This is a very close race at 3 points, but again, we have Kelly right at 50%. Barb, what does that tell you about Arizona? Is this super, super close, or is there a little bit of air here for Mark Kelly?
Well, I think he is benefiting from the fact that, a good proportion of Arizonans do have a positive impression of him, certainly as the incumbent. I think he has had a fairly good run, according to Arizonans. But again, this is a state. The registration is plus Republican, single digits, but a lot of points. He has a president of his party that, again, is not popular here, and a congressional generic statewide that looks at about +5 Republican among those most definite to vote. So, as Arizonas are going to the polls, this is a significantly Republican. It's likely to be a significantly Republican state, and he's right at the precipice of holding on to his seat, or not. He's doing incredibly well in Maricopa County, which the Democrat needs to. He's doing even better in Pima County. He actually has almost 22-point lead there. But then Masters pretty much, gets support from the rest of the state. Obviously, those are the big population areas, but the intensity of support between these two candidates is pretty even, and that's a change that we've seen. When we talk about the fact that Republicans are more mobilized to vote, it's also that they are more supportive and more firmly committed to Republican candidates. And so that intensity of support, 77 for Kelly and now 75 for Masters, doesn't give Kelly much of an edge there. So although his name recognition is +3 above water, Masters is -9 upside down. Yes, I think we would put lean Democrat, but this is a tough race.
Yeah, you wouldn't put lean in capital letters, I don't think. It would probably
No,
be lowercase.
definitely not. Definitely
Lowercase.
not. And also, I think because there is such an incredibly competitive governor's race, I think
Yes.
I think that impacts things too. I mean, this is one of the states where we saw probably the most split ticket voting originally. But again, that, people have gone much more into their partisan camps here, and independents are not as likely to vote, and they're really going to hold the balance here.
Hey, Lee, let's just note that Katie Hobbs in the Democratic race is the Democrat. She's Secretary of State right now, but she's running to be the governor. And Carrie Lake, a former TV anchor who has become a real darling of the conservatives and the Republicans, the Fox News set, is running as a Republican. This has been an incredibly tight race in every poll out there, not just ours. Has this is super tight. We should note we have them at 48-47, Hobbs ahead by 1 among registered, and 49-48, we have her ahead by 1 among those definitely voting. So I think we do need to stick a marker in that one, because this, unlike the last 2 states, actually does have a super competitive gubernatorial contest.
And also, unlike Georgia, where I think Kemp is seen as someone who stood up to Donald Trump and protected election integrity. The issue of fairness, although is not divisive as it is in Pennsylvania, there is a Democrat-Republican divide. 90% of Democrats believe the election will be fair, but a full third of Republicans and nearly a third of independents are really concerned and don't see that elections will necessarily be fair and accurate.
And the 2 Republican candidates in these 2 races, Senate and governor, they're part of the Trump denier group in the elections. And so, depending on what the vote is, we still may not have a concession out of the state, as is probably going to occur in a lot of other places in the country. I would add that Joe Biden's approval rating is at the 38% in Arizona, like it was in Georgia, but unlike Pennsylvania. So again, the Democrats have more ground to cover here. And I thought, and again, on the issues, I thought was interesting because there's a big, big split on that. And that is the Republicans overwhelmingly, more than half, say it's inflation, number one issue. Half the Democrats say it's preserving democracy. So this is worlds apart here on the issues. And I would say one other group, you mentioned the independents, Barb. The independents are slightly in Kelly's favor right now. But Kelly's also getting more Republicans, 10%. Then Masters is getting Democrats, which is only 2%. So Kelly has, and I know 10 isn't a huge number, but in a close race, they all count. And crossover for Kelly is greater than any kind of crossover appeal that Masters has. Plus, you work in the independents, and that's why the Democrats are at least alive in Arizona and may even squeak out one or two of these races.
With regard to the issues, I think one of the things that is very interesting in Arizona, people have talked about the fact that the Democrats are very dependent upon women in the suburbs, particularly those with a college education. And in Pennsylvania, we see abortion a very significant issue among that group of voters. In Arizona, it's all about democracy and preserving democracy. And I think what's very interesting is how little the abortion issue has been resonating in Arizona in particular.
Which is interesting because the law there is probably at most risk of being overturned. The law allowing for some choice in abortion is probably the most at risk of being overturned of the three states we polled, depending on who's in, but the laws the way they're written. Anyway, Lee, normally the fun fact is yours, but this isn't a fun fact. So I'm going to take a whack at this as we end this show. We dug these numbers up from 1937, and they're just kind of sadly relevant today. And I say sadly, it's my own opinion here. But in 1937, the Gallup poll asked, and we get these numbers from the Roper Center at Cornell, as we do with all of this data from the past. They asked over a series of a couple of polls that spread out in January and February of 1937. So it had been right after the 1936 election where FDR was reelected. Would you vote for a woman for president if she qualified in every other respect? Would you vote for a Catholic for president who was well qualified for this position? And would you vote for a Jew for president who is well qualified for this position? Only 33% said they would vote for a woman. 60% said they would vote for a Catholic, and 46% said they would vote for a Jewish person. 47% said no. Times have changed in some ways, but in some ways they haven't.
Yeah, I saw a lot in this question, obviously, of relevance for today because we're in such a divisive time and a time of increased intolerance where there's obviously more anti-Semitism, racism is, now front and center for a large number of communities. But I was struck by not only the numbers that you just cited, but that we haven't had a woman elected president. We haven't had a Jewish person elected president. And the one thing which was over 50 in this case was a Catholic. And 23 years after this survey was conducted, obviously John Kennedy was elected in 1960. And at this point in the poll, in 37, as you said, 60% said they would vote for a Catholic for president. So not that that was predictive of anything, but it's just interesting that where the acceptance was higher, the political system did, in not too long a time period, actually break that glass ceiling, even if other ones haven't been.
Yeah, and I think that we have been updating these questions over time. And I know that when Barack Obama was running for president, people added race in terms of Latino, also in terms of the African Americans at the time, a Black person, and other religions. I mean, Romney, as a Mormon, was running for president. And so that was also tossed into this list of kind of demographic characteristics that have isms associated with it. And I think it is telling, Lee, that the only one of this group was Catholic, and that did have a majority at that time, and I think has garnered additional support. But women still lag behind other groups, including Black Americans and Latino Americans, and also Jewish Americans. So I think
Although
there is
right now there is a female vice president and also a person of color. So that is at least part of the way to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, even if it isn't the whole ticket.
I would just finish on this by noting again that these were conducted face-to-face, door-to-door. These folks answered these questions in this way, speaking to somebody. And that says something about the times. The other is they didn't ask about a Black person. They didn't even think to ask in 1937 that you would even ask that. And then finally, with the anti-Semitism that is rearing its head so perniciously over the last however long period you want to define it, but certainly in the last few months, there's been so much evidence of this still bubbling under the surface. It is just notable that in 1937, ahead of what happened in World War II, and with Hitler and all of that, that at that time there was a split, an even split among people who thought they could see a Jewish person elected, and that still hasn't happened.
That'll do it for this edition of Poll Hub.
Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer.
Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review. Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them directly to @MaristPoll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub, and with any luck, it will cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as we release it.
We'll see you next time.